What's up, guys? You're now listening to Devo with Uncle Theo. Today is day 347, and we're going to cover Hebrews chapters 5 through 7. Last time we left off, we talked about how important the last few chapters were, especially chapter 1 of stating the deity of Christ. There were 8 specific things you could point out if someone were to ever push you into explaining the significance of Christ. You can go between chapters 1 through 3 and point out at least 8 things if they were to press you and say he was just a good teacher or a good man or a good moral guy. Chapter 1 says he's the Son, he's heir of all things, he made the world, he sustains the world, he's the radiance of his glory, he's the exact representation of his nature, he upholds all things by the word of his power, and he had made purification of sins, and he sat down at the right hand of majesty on high. And we talked about in the warnings and how the author is a great theologian, but he's also speaking from the position of a pastor. And he'll go on tangents with expositions, and he'll go on tangents with warnings. And in chapter 4, we shifted into his next argument of Jesus' superiority over the sacrificial system. Verses 14 through 16 said, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in a time of need." And we enter chapter 5. It says in verse 1, "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness, and because of it he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sin, as for the people and also for himself." And so you're going to see a big contrast here. And this would have been powerful argumentation for these Christian Jews who are looking to turn back. You can't turn back to the high priest, because the high priest you're turning back to was weaker than Christ. Not only did he provide a sacrifice for the sins of the people, he had to provide a sacrifice for his own sins. And Jesus did not have to do that. He only provided a sacrifice for other people's sin because he had not sinned himself. So he makes that argument, and then he starts to bring up Melchizedek. And this takes us back to Genesis 14 and also Psalm 110. We have to know that Old Testament theology. And it's interesting because if you're just reading Genesis 14, you don't understand where Melchizedek comes from, how he comes on the scene, and why does Abraham give a tenth of his offering to him? If you just won this mighty war, you're going to want to keep all of the spoils to yourself. But Abraham gives to this man after getting his nephew Lot back from war. But the interesting part, how the author of Hebrews makes several arguments from that. The fact that Melchizedek comes on the scene, you don't know where he came from, and you don't know where he went. He argues for the eternality of Christ based on that occurrence. Now, that argument doesn't make sense to us, but you have to remember the original audience. It would have made perfect sense for the Jews. And in that, he gives another warning. And in chapter 5, which is why he says in verse 5, "So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' Just as he says also in another passage, 'You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek.'" We move into the second warning in chapters 5, verse 11 through 6:8. And he says here, "Concerning him, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come need of milk and not solid food. Everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil." So from here we move in this section to the more controversial passages. And this is where one of the debates lies, where one side will say this is referring to experiences in the Christian community. And the other one would say, no, this is Christian language of one who is saved and loses his salvation. And to be honest with you, this debate will never end, because by the language, you can really not differentiate the two. Now, you know me by now and where I align here, which is this is language, experiential, of one being in a Christian community. And if you were to look at some of the best commentaries in Hebrews, like from F.F. Bruce or George Guthrie, will take this position, but I don't think this is where the labor needs to be had. The labor needs to take place, and this is a preacher calling these people to not turn back, who doesn't know who's in the audience that's saved and not saved. As we know, everybody in the church is not a part of the church. And so he's preaching, and in the sense, in verse 6, he says, and those who have experienced these things and then have fallen away, it is impossible to renew them again to repentance. And so you have two types of language there. One position, it is practically impossible to renew them again to repentance. And the other one is most of these terms or participles are in the present tense. So if you continue in these things, then it is impossible to renew you again to repentance. But that's one of the big debates here. But one thing we can learn from this is that baby Christians are the most susceptible to falling away. And one of the things the author is saying here is one of the ways to keep you from departing from the faith is to mature, is to grow up in your theology. And I think that's where the emphasis needs to be, not on who is right regarding their position, on what experience the author is talking to. And we wrap up here in chapter 7, and he returns to his argument on Melchizedek. Just like a good preacher, he took his tangent, now he's back to his theology. And he picks up that argument that I was mentioning before in verse 3. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning or days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. And so this argument may not be as meaningful to us as Gentiles, but you have to think about the audience at that time, and it would have been very meaningful to a Jew at that time, a Christian Jew, more specifically, who was considering turning back to his Judaism. And in verse 12, it says, for when the priesthood is changed, a necessity there takes place. And so we get some interesting language here that speaks of the weakness and the uselessness of the law. And these are statements that may make one cringe because you hear Paul saying the law is useful, but he's speaking of the law in a different way. He's speaking of the law regarding its purpose. The author of Hebrews is speaking of the law regarding its insufficiencies. It does not have the ability to impart righteousness to one or save one. And in that, it's utterly useless. Therefore, it must necessitate a change in law because we have a change in priesthood. And for that, verse 22 shows us that Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. And he's able to carry this out. Why? Verse 25, he is able to save forever to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And that's the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. He's able to save us to the uttermost because he ever lives to make intercession for us. Just like we started in chapter 1, he is set down at the right hand of majesty, which means he is Lord and he is God with the same glory of God the Father. And he has the ability to accomplish this all. He upholds the world by the power of his might. He is the Son. He is the radiance of the Father. He is the exact representation. And because of this, we worship Jesus and not merely respect him as a good person of history or leader. Learn well from Hebrews because the theology is immense. And I pray that it nourishes you and sustains you in your Christian walk and journey.